Welcome back. The federal government has to respond to a Quebec court ruling last year that found restricting access to medically assisted dying only to those Canadians whose imminent death is, quote, reasonably foreseeable is unconstitutional. Today, the government launched, in response, 2 weeks of online consultations to allow Canadians to weigh in on what should happen. The feds have until March 11th to change the law. Earlier, I spoke with David Lametti, Minister of Justice from Halifax. For a Canadian to be eligible for medically assisted death, the patient's death, must be reasonably foreseeable. Given the Quebec court's decision, was it a mistake to include that in the legislation?
Look, we proposed legislation in 2016 knowing that this would be part of an evolution. As Canadian society evolved, as the practice of medical assistance in dying took hold and has become accepted across Canada. There have been a number of positive experiences that have been, stories that have been told in the media. We're in a different place now than we were in 2016. So the criterion of reasonable foreseeability of death it was being challenged in a number of places across the country, but it's the Quebec Superior Court that made a decision. And we have decided not to appeal that decision. We are going to begin consultations today with experts across the country, with people who represent communities that feel vulnerable, with medical practitioners who provide the service, and we're consulting Canadians. We knew the situation would evolve. So there's a parliamentary review that begins this June, looking at more profound issues, if you will.
Can you give me an example of what a more profound issue would be?
Well, the three that were identified in the 2016 law were the question of advanced directives generally, the question of mental illness, and the question of mature minors. And all three have already been the subject of study. We have the Council of Canadian Academies that has produced excellent reports on all three of those issues. Other studies will come out. Quebec has produced one on advanced directives.
Okay, I have to challenge you for a second on the idea that this is just about Canadian society moving to a different place, because at the outset, when the legislation was being crafted, concerns about adding in that clause regarding reasonably foreseeable were raised by a number of different stakeholders. It also wasn't prescribed by the Supreme Court's decision. This was a very specific decision that your government made at the time. Was it the wrong decision?
Well, I don't know if it was right or wrong. We were trying to strike a balance. We have always been trying to strike a balance between the autonomy of individuals and perhaps best represented in that Supreme Court decision in Carter, that particular line of thinking, with a real fear on the part of a number of different Canadians who saw themselves as vulnerable in the legislation, or from service providers, the doctors and other medical practitioners, who felt that perhaps we needed some safeguards. So that legislation represented where we thought we were in 2016, and you're right to say that it wasn't unanimously supported, and a number of people thought the law might be unconstitutional at that point. That being said, we now have 4 years of experience. We now have a better, I think it's fair to say, a greater degree of acceptance across Canada of the practice of medical assistance in dying. And so we're in a place where we can move forward, again, trying to strike the appropriate balances. We're always dealing with people who are suffering. We're dealing with their families who are supporting them. And so we have to be sensitive, we have to be empathetic, we have to be sensitive to communities that still feel vulnerable, even after the Truchon decision. And so we need to keep all of that in the balance. As we move forward. So it's really part of an evolution.
The deadline set by Quebec's court is March 11th. Will your government introduce new legislation by then? We're already in the middle of January.
Well, my goal as Minister of Justice is to have a bill in front of the House of Commons as soon as possible, and then we'll see. We're in a minority parliament. We have to speak with House leaders. We have to speak with people across the House. When we have a bill and we see what's in it, people can react properly to it. There may be a quick consensus to move it forward. I don't know. We haven't ruled out the possibility of seeking an extension. But for the time being, the goal is to get a bill in front of the House of Commons.
Just to be clear, to get that bill in front of the House of Commons prior to March 11th.
Absolutely, yes. As soon as possible, but obviously before March 11th.
As the government begins consultations on Canada's doctor-assisted suicide laws today, one mental health advocate says that it should be available to people with mental illness, something that's currently not allowed. Arthur Gallant has spent almost 20 years living with mental illness, including borderline personality disorder and generalized anxiety. He says he would like to have the option available to him in the future. Mr. Gallant joins us now from our Toronto studios. Hi there. Nice to see you.
Hi there, Vashi. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. I imagine it's not easy. And I just want to say that you had reached out to me through an email this morning describing this. And you had said that you're not suicidal, that you've received treatment, but that you just want the option available to you. Can you explain why?
So I received very capable treatment from those at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton. And the reason why I want that option available to me is for the same reason that people want abortion to continue to be legalized. I want medically assisted death to be available to people with mental illness for the same reason that people wanted same-sex marriage to become legalized. I just don't think that we should have people who aren't affected by, who don't have mental illness or don't understand the suffering that some people with mental illness have, to tell us that we should not be allowed to have this option available. I have, as you mentioned in my intro, I've had mental illness for 20 years. My doctors have told me it's incurable. I mean, therapy can make it a little better. But they've made it clear to me that while therapy will help me with my quality of life, in order for therapy to continue to be effective for life, I'm going to have to keep on top of treatment. And I'm going to be 30 years old on Thursday. And if I live to be 70 or 80 years old, that's a long time to commit to treatment. I've suffered in the past. I've tried taking my own life once when I was 16 and once when I was 21. It ended up with me going to the hospital, having my stomach pumped, and then being discharged saying, someone will call you in a few weeks, and then having to wait months for treatment. So it's not so much that I want to, kill myself today or have a doctor help me kill myself, but I just need to know that if there comes a point in the future, and I hope that it never does, that there is an option available to me. One thing that I was talking about earlier with a friend, Vashi, and I'm sorry to take up so much time on this question, but I think it's very important, is also it has to deal with the suffering of the family members of people who live with mental illness. Can you imagine, walking into your child's room and seeing them dead and, foaming at the mouth? I'm really sorry to your viewers for that graphic depiction. Or someone who's jumped from a high story. I know someone who several years ago killed themselves after jumping off of a bridge, and they were so disfigured that their family was advised not to even physically identify the body or have an open casket at the funeral. So I hear family members of people who have had a medically assisted death from a physical terminal ailment saying that it was such a peaceful way to go. And if worse comes to worse, if it comes down to that, that's how I would like my passing to be. I would like my passing to be the same way that I euthanized my dog a few years ago. I want it to be as peaceful, where I just, drift off into the sunset.
What do you say to people, and, I hope this doesn't sound naive, but people who are concerned that rather than seek treatment, people with mental illness will go down this route if it's available to them?
So, while I haven't spoken to the government yet, what I would be calling for, if this becomes available, and if the Justice Minister or his staff are watching this interview, I really hope they're listening closely. I don't think that you should walk into a psychiatrist's office and say, doctor, I haven't been feeling great lately, and the doctor diagnoses you with depression. I really think that in order for this to be available to someone like myself living with mental illness, that it needs to be chronic, and there needs to be a prolonged period of someone living with their illness. There needs to be a prolonged period of treatments tried and, maybe not be doing very well. I don't think medically assisted death should be the first thing we jump to. I really think it should be a worst case scenario when all else fails.
And there would be, I'm guessing, I'm inferring from what you're saying, some sort of process by which by which an independent person would judge that, would sort of say, here are the steps that need to be followed, and they have or they haven't. My understanding is that's how it happens now anyway.
Yeah, so it's my understanding as well of people with physical illnesses that, you know, they're assessed by one doctor, and then within a certain amount of time, you know, a second doctor assesses them. So I don't necessarily think it would be a direct member of my treatment team, but possibly, you know, them referring me to, you know, a third party or something, someone who can go through my clinical files, objectively look at this and make a recommendation or determination whether or not I should be allowed to go through with this. But it also, as we call the Senate, you know, a place of sober second thought. And I think having this period of time where we can sort of have someone objectively look at this and just, you know, give it some consideration. It also gives the patient or the client some time to think, is this what I really want to do? And I feel like, you know, doctors, when they've been dealing with the same patient for years, they kind of develop tunnel vision. So if you have someone who looks at an application for medically assisted suicide objectively, you would think that they would, you know, go to the patient and or their treatment team and say, hey, you know, have you tried this? Or, you know, before I agree to further consider your application further, you need to try this treatment or this medication first. And then, you know, if you believe it still hasn't been effective. But the bottom line, Vashi, is that someone who's really determined to take their own life is going to take their own life. And what I'm simply advocating for is I want it to be peaceful and I want it to be dignified. And so rather than someone losing their life tragically, but another thing that I want to point out is that you know, just the suffering that someone has. There's a fear that, because right now the medically assisted death, you know, legislation, says someone needs to be of a sound mind and consent. And what I think when we talk about that is if someone were to do something that disfigured them, or for example, you take an overdose and that causes someone to have brain damage, if they're in an ICU on a ventilator, they no longer have the ability to consent. And so, you know, so this gives them a pathway, knowing that there is an avenue for them to do it while they're still of sound mind.
I have to leave it there, but I really want to thank you for coming on, for sharing your views, and for being so frank with them. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Vashi.
That's Arthur Gallant for us in Toronto. We do want to add that if you are contemplating taking your own life, help is available for suicide crisis and prevention. You can call 911 or seek support, of course, from a local crisis center in your area. And the Canada Suicide Prevention Service is also available. The number is right there at the bottom of your screen, 1-833-456-4566. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.